What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today, as you can tell by the title, we are finally going to be jumping into the first hero guide for the new BB units, this one focusing on BB-9E. There is a whole lot to go through in this one, as these guys do have those extra passive abilities to cover, plus a more unique playstyle, and I am actually going to be changing up the format of my normal hero guides in that today I am going to be covering different star card builds similar to what I did for all of my class guides. You can see on screen what we're going to be going through. We will of course start off with his base stats, then go through and break down all of his abilities, plus I'll touch on those passive abilities as well, and then I will touch on some tips for both the large scale game modes and the hero game modes, covering two different card loadouts for each mode, as well as then just some general gameplay tips as well. So if that is what you guys are looking for in a hero guide, then make sure to drop a like on the video. Now, as always, keep in mind that almost everything in this guide was tested in arcade, so just bear in mind that if you see any stats that don't seem right, then that is most likely due to those small arcade differences. So, getting stuck into it, first off we're going to take a look at his base HP, and he does have the equal lowest health pool in the game, coming in at a very low 600 HP. On top of that though, he has the ability to regen 250 HP, which is pretty much on par with the average saber user, so despite the low health pool, his regen is higher than that of a blaster hero. Now, his weapon of choice is his trusty little shock prod, which is obviously a very unique weapon in the game, and not only will it deal damage, but it will also stun the enemy for a quick second as well, which is unique from BB-8 as he doesn't have that feature. It deals 24 damage to the enemy no matter what angle you hit them from, and if you do hold the trigger, it'll pretty much damage them 3 times per second, so going by that, it deals 72 damage per second. A quick little tip for this weapon is that you can actually activate it with either L2 or R2, or say on PC it'd be both the left and right mouse buttons, and holding them down doesn't actually affect the stamina drain. However, if you alternate them like you would with an ARC Trooper, it will actually drain the stamina twice as fast without dealing any more damage. So holding them both down is fine, although it's essentially pointless as it does the same thing as holding one trigger down, so I'd personally recommend just only using the R2 or the left mouse button, similar to how you would with just a saber, just to be safe. Now, moving on to his abilities, and he does of course have the regular 3 abilities plus those 3 passive abilities as well, so we are going to quickly go through and cover all 6 of those abilities. Starting off with his L1 ability, this is his smokescreen, which has an 18-second cooldown, and this one just causes the droid to deploy a smokescreen around himself, blocking the view of his enemies. It does also reveal nearby enemies as well through the thermal scanning, and those enemies and the smoke will stay active for 12 seconds. This ability is awesome for causing a bit of chaos with that smoke. You can rush into a room of enemies with it activated and roll around their ankles to kind of distort their vision, therefore letting your teammates get into those objectives, and it's also just great for situational awareness as well because of that scanner. Its only real downside is that sometimes the smoke can actually obstruct your own view, which is mostly fine because of the scanner, but if enemies are further away than the scanner can reach, then sometimes it will actually work against you. Moving on to his L1R1 ability, this one is called Shock Spin, and it has a bit of a longer 25-second cooldown. This ability causes the droid to send out a pulse that knocks down nearby enemies, dealing 90 damage on the initial hit and then 30 damage per second thereafter, staying active for 8 seconds. This one is amazing when it comes to crowd control or clearing out objectives. You can just easily knock down half the enemy team, leaving them much more vulnerable for you and your teammates. Its only real downside, honestly, is that sometimes it can kind of give you a false sense of strength, as oftentimes I've died thinking it's more powerful than it really is. Plus, sometimes it actually knocks enemies too far away to where they're actually safer than they were before you used it. Moving on now to the R1 ability, this one is called Charge Up, and it has a pretty decent 15-second cooldown. This one is pretty much the same thing as the blast command for the officer in a way, giving you and your teammates unlimited fire from blasters or shocks from your shock prod during the 5 seconds that it's active, and it will also increase the cooldown of your teammates, or technically decreasing the cooldown, as it does make them cool down faster. This ability is really underrated in my opinion. It's amazing for team play and helping push or lock down objectives, and it's also just great for if your shock prod overheats, you can simply use it to get unlimited stamina for a few seconds. As for its weaknesses, I honestly couldn't think of any glaring weaknesses with it, so let me know if you guys can think of any, but for me there's nothing about it that I would consider to be a weakness. Now, moving on to those passive abilities that I mentioned, and for those who don't know what these are, essentially these are just abilities that are always active and always working for you in the background without actually having to do anything. The first one is obviously just the health on kill, which every hero in the game has as well, other than Bosk of course, and this just means that with each regular kill you'll gain back 20 HP or 100 HP if you do manage to kill a hero. The next one is called Technical Support, and this makes it so that you actually count as 2 players when you're capturing an objective. So say you're on a command post, it will actually capture twice as fast as if you were just alone with a trooper. And the even better part is stuff like planting bombs also happens twice as fast as well, which is a game changer in GA especially, plus in those capital ships as well. If you do see BB-9E near an objective, try and let him capture it or plant the bomb or whatever while you defend him from enemies, as it will actually go twice as fast. Now, lastly, he does also have another passive ability called Back to Support, where he actually heals nearby teammates constantly so long as they do stay close enough. It's unfortunately pretty hard to tell exactly how big the area of effect is or how much HP your teammates will regain, but it does happen pretty slowly, so keep in mind that it's not like an instant health buff or anything like that. So that is it for all of his base stats and abilities. Now we're going to move on to some of the more important stuff, starting with his best star cards for the large scale game modes. Usually I only show about 3 or 4 cards in this section, but as I said, these guys are pretty unique and obviously they're mostly built for playing the objective. So I've gone ahead and made 2 different star card builds to show you guys, the objective based build and the Slayer build. So we're going to start off with the objective build, as in my opinion this is the way that BB-9E is best played in these modes, and this build is purely focused on helping your teammates as much as possible rather than going for kill streaks or anything like that. So the first card I'm going to recommend is his full reconstruction card, and this one will actually give him more health regen by up to 100 HP when fully maxed. With this equipped you can actually go all the way down to 250 HP and still fully regen, and so obviously the more survivability you have, the more likely you're going to be able to stick in there on those objectives and help your teammates get the win. The next card I'd recommend using is the Potent Bacta card, which increases the radius of his Bacta support at the cost of a slightly slower cooldown. Again, this is just going to help heal a few more teammates around those objectives, and the more teammates you can keep alive, the more likely you are to take or defend those objectives. Now, for the third card, this is the Supercharged card, which increases the radius of that charge up ability by up to 7 whole meters when fully maxed. Now, 7 meters doesn't really seem like that much, but trust me guys, that is a pretty hefty buff, and with that, you're going to give so many more teammates that unlimited blast of fire, meaning they can deal a whole lot more damage to your enemies. Now, if you do want to replace any of those cards, one card that is equally as good is the Swift Power card, and this just reduces the cooldown of that charge up ability. This just kind of speaks for itself. You'll be able to use it much more often, and therefore your teammates will be running around with unlimited blast of fire more often than not. Now, moving on to the Slayer build, and this one is for those of you who maybe aren't as interested in playing the objective, or maybe you do want to play the objective but just play it a bit more aggressively and be able to kill enemies a lot easier. The first card is of course the full reconstruction card. Again, pretty self-explanatory, more health regen equals more survivability, which more often than not will equal more kills. Next up is the faster card, and this one makes it so that when you hit multiple enemies, being only 2 when it is fully maxed, that shock spin ability will then deal double damage after that first pulse. So if you go into a room and hit a couple of enemies with the middle ability, it'll then deal double damage, which is 60 damage per second for 8 seconds after that pulse, enough to kill all classes other than the heavy in just 1 second after the activation. Now lastly, the third card is the Linked System card, which makes it so that for every 4 successful enemy stuns with that shock prod, its damage will be increased by 1 to a maximum of 8. That means that after anywhere from 8 to 15 or so kills, depending on how many stuns you get per kill, your shock prod will actually deal 32 damage per hit instead of 24, meaning it'll take 5 zaps rather than 7, saving you about half a second per kill. So it's kind of situational in a way, but it is a decent card to use nonetheless. So that is it for both of those star card builds. I'd still recommend mixing and matching cards if it suits you better, but you guys seem to love the card builds in my class guide, so I thought I'd implement them into these hero guides. So now moving on to some of the best maps to choose BB-9E on when you're playing Galactic Assault, and the top 3 that I've picked are Naboo, Jakku and Camino. All of these maps have one thing in common, and that is close quarters chaotic objectives where BB-9E's team play absolutely thrives. Now obviously I could do the same for Supremacy, but he is only available on 3 maps, and so I hardly thought that was worth it, so just keep in mind those suggestions are just for Galactic Assault. Now, as for some tips for the large scale game modes, and like I touched on at the start, these new droids are almost solely built for helping your team in and around the objectives, and so that should always be on your mind first and foremost. Now, that's not to say that you can't get kill streaks with them. Multiple people have already cracked the 100 kill streak mark less than a week after launch, but they are very clearly designed to be support based characters, which even the developers have said themselves. The first tip I'd have is just to not go too aggressively like you would with other heroes, as the damage output for BB-9E is pretty bad to be honest, not so much in terms of the actual damage per second, but just in the way that you have to damage your enemies. as you're limited to only one type of attack, which is to get close enough to the enemies to damage them with either the prod or the shock spin. BB-9E essentially has all the downsides of a saber hero. For example, you have to get really close to get kills, essentially being useless from range, but he also has the downsides of a blaster hero in that you have no blocking ability and you don't have a force jump either like the saber users do, so he is definitely very unique in that aspect. Now, he can still be a little beast at getting kills, it's just that you have to do it differently than how you would with anyone else. With blasters, you usually want to pick off enemies one by one while keeping a bit of range between you and your enemies. With sabers, you want to just kind of get in and out and take enemies out as fast as you can, even in large groups, but for BB-9E, it's all about picking enemies off one by one, especially if you can do so without them seeing you. You almost have to play him a little bit stealthily in that you want to stay hidden as long as you can, then quickly go towards the enemy, pick him off before he can deal much damage, and then head back to a relatively safe spot to re-evaluate the situation. If you roll into a room of 6 or 7 enemies, sure, you might be able to use that shock spin ability and take a heap of them, if not all of them out, but you also might not be able to do that, at which point you've wasted an ability and now have 6 or 7 enemies shooting at you without any kind of defense. The best counter to this kind of situation is simply to stick with your teammates as much as possible, as having teammates nearby is going to be a complete game changer with how small you are. If an enemy comes around a corner and sees you and 2 troopers, the troopers are so much bigger than you are that they're probably going to focus on the troopers first, and hell, sometimes they might not even see you because of that, at which point you can roll up and get a pretty easy kill. On the other hand, if they come around the corner and see a black beach ball sitting there with no defense and no other enemies in sight, a few quick headshots can end you before you know it, and so like I said, having teammates nearby is arguably the most important part of surviving. Now on top of that, there are all the more obvious tips that all just relate to playing the objective, so using that charge up whenever you're in an action packed area with a lot of teammates, using the smoke when you need to block your enemy's view, and using the shock spin when you need to try and clear some room for your teammates to come in and help you out. All of his abilities serve a really solid purpose, and it's super important that you do make the most of them whenever possible. The same thing goes for those passive abilities too. For example, if you can't do too much to help get kills in a chaotic area, then just staying nearby behind cover can help with the back to support and the charge up ability as well. These droids, and specifically BB-9E, can be extremely hard to get the hang of as they have such unique playstyles, but if you just keep in mind that he is meant to be played with an objective mindset, then you should be able to do really well with him even if your kill streak doesn't necessarily show it. So that is going to be it for the Galactic Assault and Supremacy tips. Now we're going to move on to some of the tips for the Hero vs Villain game mode, starting off with the best star cards. Again, we do have 2 different builds, being a support build and the Slayer build. Starting off with the support build, this one is just focused on being near your teammates and helping keep them alive while also doing your part with a few kills here and there, generally just doing the team thing to help your team win the game. This setup is actually identical to the GA and Supremacy version, so rather than going through it all again, I'll just pop those cards up on screen again to give you guys a quick reminder. If you're not as good at getting a heap of kills with BB-9E, then this is definitely a good option for cards, as you can still really help your team out more than you'd probably think. Now, the next build is once again the Slayer build, which is obviously just to be a bit more aggressive and to get a few more kills throughout the game. Now, the first 2 cards are the same as the previous Slayer build, but the last card is actually replaced by the Spin Me Round card, as that one with the extra prod damage just really isn't viable in these modes. Spin Me Round makes enemies hit by that shock spin get pushed a lot further back than they would have otherwise, and this one is more for a defensive type of ability, as being a bit harder to survive against heroes, you can use this push to push enemies away and then roll to safety or to regroup with your teammates. Again, I would still recommend trying all the cards out, but these 2 builds are definitely a good place to start. Now, moving on to some tips for the hero game modes, and if I'm gonna be honest, BB-9E is actually pretty damn hard to do well within these modes, at least when it comes to getting kills. He's actually a really good team player and can honestly turn the tide of a game without even getting a kill, but in terms of getting a ton of kills, he is pretty hard to play, at least for me anyway. What you need to keep in mind is that he does have that stun on his regular attacks, which is really useful. However, if you do hold the attack button, the stun only works at the start, not every time you deal damage. If you're in a 1v1, what you want to do is not just hold the trigger, but instead you want to hit them with it once, get the stun and then deal some damage until they do break free of that stun lock. Once they are free of the stun, you want to make the most of those rolls, avoid them as well as you can, and then after maybe 2 or 3 seconds, the stun will be available again, at which point you can stun them, deal some more damage, and pretty much just rinse and repeat. If the enemy has even a slight idea of what they're doing, especially with a saber hero, you are going to have a hard time, to be honest, but if you can use that little tactic and try to move and dodge as much as possible in combination with the stun and the fast damage, you can still do pretty well in a 1v1. For the most part though, you do want to try and just be a support player first and foremost, always sticking near your teammates and trying to force a few 2v1s or 3v2s, pretty much just being there to help your teammates while they deal most of the damage. While they're doing that, you're there to heal them with that back to support, deal some quick damage with the shock prod, and especially to stun enemies so you and your teammates can kind of gang up on them while they are stunned. Now, I usually do the characters to look out for section, however honestly every character can do very well against you, so I didn't think there was too much of a point. Treat every character in the game like they do have the upper hand and try to outsmart them rather than outstrength them, and with a lot of practice you should still be able to do pretty well with BB-9E in the hero game modes. But anyway guys, that is going to be it for our BB-9E hero guide. Hopefully some of these tips did help you guys out, and if they did then make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel with those notifications on so you don't miss out on any more Battlefront 2 videos or live streams. There will also be a BB-8 hero guide out within the next week, so be sure to keep your eyes peeled for that one as well. Thank you all so much for watching, you guys have a great day and I'll catch you all in the next one.
Crush them, make them suffer.